A dying widow clutched her newborns, whispering her last wish, that they bear her name. The mountain man who found her would honor it, but his choice would shatter the whole town. The storm had not yet broken when Thomas Hale heard the cries. They carried through the pines, high and desperate, echoing between the slopes like the voice of someone calling from the grave itself. He swung down from his horse without hesitation, boots crunching into the half-frozen earth, and he followed the sound through the dark woods until his hand pushed aside the low branches and revealed a scene that stole his breath. A woman lay in the snow, her face pale with the color of death pressing against her skin, her body curled around two tiny bundles wrapped in torn cloth. Her lips trembled as she tried to raise her head, her eyes locking on him with a kind of pleading that pierced straight into his soul. "Please," she gasped, her breath barely more than smoke in the cold air. "I won't see them grow up. Name them after me." The words broke in half as though every syllable was a wound, and she reached a trembling hand toward him before it fell limp against the ground. Thomas knelt beside her, tearing his coat free from his shoulders to shield the infants from the bitter air. He pressed his hand against her brow, trying to find warmth, life, something to cling to. The babies whimpered, their voices thin, their skin reddened and fragile. He had delivered calves, foals, even once a lamb caught in a storm, but never had he held anything so small, so helpless, and so near to death. "What's your name?" he demanded, urgency in his voice, but her lips quivered without forming the word. Her eyes filled with tears, sliding down her cold cheeks as she turned them back to the children. That was answer enough. She wanted them to bear her name. That final, breaking plea had been her legacy. Thomas could feel the storm pressing closer, the scent of snow in the air, the way the treetops bent as if heaven itself were bowing. He had no time to dig graves, no time to carry her weight in theirs. He had to choose in a heartbeat, save the children and leave her, or lose them all in a vain attempt to carry 3 lives against a storm that was already swallowing the horizon. His jaw tightened as the snow began to fall, dusting his shoulders like the touch of ash. He gathered the babies in his arms, their cries muffled against his chest, and for a moment he bowed his head over her still body. "Your children will not be forgotten," he swore, and the words felt like iron chains locking into place. He turned, heart pounding, forcing his legs through the drifts as he staggered back toward his horse. The storm howled its fury, as if to bury her and him and everything between in one furious breath. The horse balked, eyes wide with the scent of death, but Thomas thrust the bundles against his chest, tightened his grip on the reins, and pulled himself into the saddle. The babies wailed as the wind tore at them, and he bent low, shielding them with his body, spurring the horse toward the ridgeline. Every stride felt like defiance against the night itself, against the cruel hand that had stolen the mother's last breath and left him burdened with a charge he had never asked for. By the time he reached the valley floor, the snow was coming down in a torrent, and his cabin lay another hour's ride to the west. He pushed his horse until foam flecked its mane, but the sound of the crying, high, desperate, never ceasing, gave him strength. When he finally burst through the door of his cabin, nearly tearing it from the hinges, he collapsed onto the rough-hewn floor, laying the children beside the fire. His hands shook as he stripped off his wet clothes and wrapped them in every dry blanket he could find. The flames licked high, filling the room with a fragile warmth, but their cries grew weaker, their bodies trembling in a way that made his chest ache. He had no milk to give, no woman to nurse them, no idea how to keep such tiny lives from slipping into the same silence as their mother. And yet he remembered her words, "Name them after me." He had never been a man to weep, but tears stung his eyes as he whispered into the firelight, "What was your name? Who were you?" He would have his answer sooner than he expected, for when he rode into town the next day, the infants wrapped close to his chest, faces pale with hunger, every head turned. And from the edge of the crowd, a voice rang out, sharp and broken, "Those children, they belong to Clara." Gasps shuddered through the gathering. Thomas turned, the names of the dead woman finally echoing through the street. Clara, the widow who had vanished from Bitter Hollow 2 months prior, the woman whose husband had died in the mines, leaving her penniless. Many had whispered she'd gone mad, wandering the mountains. None had expected she would return like this, through her children, carried in the arms of a mountain man who had no claim, no kinship, no right, and yet carried them like his very heart was bound to them. The sheriff's hand rested on his revolver. The pastor bowed his head, lips moving in silent prayer, and the town waited, breath held, for Thomas Hale to speak. But when he opened his mouth, the words he gave shook them more than anything they had expected. The weight of every eye pressed on Thomas Hale as he stood in the middle of Bitter Hollow's main street, the cries of the two newborns slicing through the silence. He had never been a man to speak often, much less with the whole town staring at him, but he knew there was no hiding now. Their suspicion, their judgment, their hunger for answers, all of it gnawed at him as surely as the storm had the night before. "They're hers," Thomas said, his voice steady though his chest burned. "Clara's. I found her." His throat tightened, and the memory of her hand reaching toward him, pleading for her children, cut through him like the edge of a blade. He swallowed hard and finished. "She's gone. I buried her where she fell." The murmur spread like wildfire through the gathered townsfolk, disbelief mingling with the raw shock of loss. Some lowered their heads, others covered their mouths with trembling hands. Clara had been a widow, but she had also been theirs, one of the few who'd stayed when others fled the harsh mountain winters. She had scrubbed floors for pennies, sewed clothes until her hands bled, and gone without meals so her neighbors' children might eat. And now her children stood, or rather cried before them, swaddled in the arms of a stranger. "You expect us to take your word for it?" Sheriff Alder's voice cut through the crowd. His hat brim shadowed his eyes, but Thomas felt the heat of his gaze like a torch against his skin. "You bring two babes into town and tell us Clara birthed them and died in the snow, and we're just supposed to believe it." Thomas adjusted the blankets around the infants, his jaw working. "Believe what you like, I was there. I heard her last words." "And what words were those?" asked Ruth Miller, a stern widow herself, standing near the front of the crowd. Thomas looked down at the children, whose faces had gone quiet from exhaustion. He felt the storm's bite still clinging to their skin. Then he said the words as if Clara's ghost still whispered them in his ear. She said, "I won't see them grow up, name them after me." The air shifted. Those words carried the weight of farewell, of truth no man could fabricate. Ruth's hand flew to her lips, and even Sheriff Alder's stance softened, if only for a heartbeat. But just as quickly, suspicion flooded back in. "If she wanted them named for her, then you've no place deciding anything for them," someone muttered from the back. "They belong to this town, not to a mountain man hiding in the hills." The pastor, Reverend Jonah Price, stepped forward then, his weathered hands raised as if to calm the tide. "Let us not be quick to judgment. The Lord sees all, and he knows what happened on that mountain. These little ones are innocent. Quarreling won't keep them alive." Thomas's eyes narrowed. Alive. That was all he had thought of since he'd pulled them from the snow. Already they had grown weaker, their tiny mouths rooting against the blankets as if searching for the mother who would never feed them. His nights were spent listening to their cries, his hands clumsy as he tried to keep them warm, his heart sick with the thought that each breath they took might be their last. "I'll take them," a voice broke in. It was Marion Fletcher, wife of the wealthiest rancher in town. She was tall, graceful, her gloved hands resting against her full skirts. "My husband and I have the means. Clara's children shouldn't grow up in a cabin with a man who doesn't know the first thing about caring for them." The crowd turned toward Thomas again, waiting. For a long moment he said nothing. He had never planned for a family. His life was rough, cut out of the wilderness with an axe and rifle. And yet when he looked down at the children, their faces delicate as porcelain, he knew with a terrible certainty that if he gave them up, he would betray the dying woman's final plea. "They stay with me," Thomas said at last, the words hard as iron. The crowd erupted in argument. Some shouted agreement, praising him for stepping up when no one else had. Others cursed his stubbornness, demanding the children be raised by townsfolk who knew civilization rather than a recluse who barely showed his face once a season. The sheriff finally lifted his hand. "Quiet," the street hushed. "This isn't for us to fight over today. Let the mountain man take them for now. But mark me, Thomas Hale, if those children come to harm, the town will remember who carried them away." Thomas gave a sharp nod and turned his back on them, his boots heavy against the dirt street. The cries of the infants echoed in his ears as he mounted his horse and rode back toward the mountains, leaving behind a town split in judgment and heavy with whispers. That night by the fire, Thomas tried to feed the children a mixture of warm cow's milk in a rag. It dribbled down their cheeks, most of it wasted, but a little made it into their mouths. They whimpered weakly, their eyes closing, bodies curling into one another for warmth. He sat there through the long hours, fighting the terror that gripped him each time their breathing slowed, each time the fire dimmed, each time his own exhaustion threatened to drag him under. At one point he drifted off. When he woke, the cabin was cold, the fire burned low, and silence filled the room. His heart lurched as he scrambled to the bundles on the floor. He pressed his ear close, hands trembling. Then, faint but real, he heard it, the soft, shallow breath of life. Both were still alive, though barely. "Don't leave me too," he whispered, though he wasn't sure if he was speaking to them, to Clara, or to God himself. His throat burned, his eyes stung, and his hands shook as he fed the fire until it blazed bright again. He knew then that if they were to survive, he couldn't do it alone. And yet who could he trust in town? Marion Fletcher wanted them for herself. Others thought he was unfit. Still, there was one woman he remembered, Hannah Parker, a widow herself who had taken in strays before. If anyone could help, it was her. The next morning he wrapped the children and rode to her homestead. She opened the door with suspicion, but when she saw the infants, her stern features broke into shock. She ushered him in, scolding him for his clumsy attempts at feeding them. Within minutes, she had prepared a proper mix, coaxing them to drink. Their tiny bodies relaxed, their cries softened, and Thomas felt a weight lift from his chest he hadn't realized he carried. "You did right to bring them here," Hannah said, though her tone carried warning. "But Thomas, what you've taken on, it will break you if you're not careful." He looked at the children, their eyes fluttering shut against the warmth of Hannah's hearth. "Then let it break me," he said quietly. "I made her a promise." And outside, unseen in the shadows beyond Hannah's window, a figure listened. A man with narrowed eyes and clenched fists, whose voice would soon stir the whole town into a storm fiercer than the one that had buried Clara. The man in the shadows stood motionless, his breath fogging against the cold morning air as he watched through Hannah Parker's window. His name was Curtis Fletcher, husband to Marion, son of the wealthiest cattle baron in Bitter Hollow, and a man who had long believed that what the Fletchers desired was theirs by right. His wife's words in the street had not been spoken idly. They wanted Clara's children, not out of compassion, but because the presence of orphans in their household would polish the shine on their family's reputation. And Curtis, ever eager to expand his power, would see it done no matter the cost. He turned away from the window, his boots crunching against the frozen earth as he mounted his horse. In his mind, the image of Thomas Hale holding those children burned like a brand. A reclusive mountain man raising Clara's offspring. To Curtis, it was an insult. By nightfall, half the town would know Thomas was already seeking help in secret, proof to Curtis that the man was unfit for such responsibility. Inside Hannah's cabin, Thomas had no idea of the danger circling closer. He sat stiffly by the hearth, watching as Hannah cradled one of the infants with the natural ease of a woman who had soothed countless little ones. She coaxed the child to drink, murmuring softly, while the other slept curled against a folded quilt. For the first time since that stormy night, Thomas allowed himself to breathe without fear of the silence that followed. "You'll need more than visits to me," Hannah said gently. "They need milk, they need steady care. I can help, but you'll have to learn. These babes can't live on stubbornness alone." Thomas's jaw tightened, though not from pride. He knew she was right. He leaned forward, calloused hands pressed together. "Teach me, whatever it takes." Her expression softened. Hannah was not a woman easily moved, but she recognized something raw in Thomas's voice, a vow forged in grief. She nodded slowly. "Then you'll come each morning. I'll show you what I know. But Thomas, you should be ready. The town won't leave this alone. There are whispers already." He looked at the children. Their tiny chests rose and fell, each breath a fragile miracle. Let them whisper. They weren't there when she begged me. That night Thomas returned to his mountain cabin. The fire glowed warmly, but his mind raced with Hannah's warning. He knew the truth of her words. Bitter Hollow was a town that thrived on rumors, and rumors about babies left behind by a dying widow were bound to multiply like weeds. He tucked the children close and whispered into the dark, "I'll keep you safe. I swore it." But the next morning, as he rode back into town, the stares were sharper, the whispers louder. He could feel them, barbed and unrelenting, as though the whole settlement had decided to judge him in silence. "Did you hear?" he claims Clara asked him. "Reckon he just wants them for himself." A wild man like that, Those babes won't last the winter." He kept his head high, refusing to answer, but inside each word stung. He tethered his horse outside Hannah's home and stepped through her door to find her already preparing fresh milk. The children stirred at the scent, their faint cries easing as she fed them. For a while, the world felt quiet, almost bearable. But outside, Curtis Fletcher was already spreading his poison. He gathered men in the saloon, buying rounds of whiskey and leaning close with the easy grin of a man who knew how to twist others to his will. "You've seen him," Curtis said, voice dripping with disdain. "A mountain hermit living half wild, thinking he can raise Clara's children. It's a disgrace. They should be with decent folk, people like us who can provide." The men grumbled agreement. Some nodded reluctantly, others more eagerly. Curtis leaned back smug. "The town's got to decide. Will we let a recluse claim them, or will we put them in proper hands?" By evening, the talk had spread like wildfire. The church bell rang, calling a meeting, and Thomas found himself standing once more in the center of Bitter Hollow, the children swaddled tightly against his chest. The townsfolk gathered, their faces set with unease, curiosity, or outright hostility. Reverend Jonah Price raised his hands. "Brothers and sisters, we gather because Clara's children are ours to protect. Let us speak, let us pray, and let us decide rightly." Marian Fletcher stepped forward first, her face serene, her voice carefully woven with false humility. "Clara was a dear friend. She would want her children raised in a home of stability and love. My husband and I can give them that." A murmur of approval swept through the crowd. Marian's fine clothes and practiced tone painted a picture of prosperity. But before Thomas could speak, Ruth Miller's stern voice cut in. "And what of the mountain man who carried them down from the storm? Without him, they'd be lying cold beside Clara's grave. Doesn't that count for something?" The crowd faltered, torn. Thomas stepped forward, his voice low but firm. "I made her a promise. Her last breath was for them. She begged me to name them after her. You can take everything else from me, but you won't take that." The square fell into silence. His words hung heavy, echoing like a prayer, but Curtis's face hardened and he spat on the ground. "Promises don't feed babies. Promises don't keep them alive." The tension snapped like a wire. Arguments erupted, voices clashing, anger spilling into the night air. Some demanded the children stay with Thomas, honoring Clara's last wish. Others shouted they should go to the Fletchers, or even be divided among different families. The chaos roared until Reverend Price rang the church bell again, silencing them. "We'll settle this in 3 days' time," the Reverend declared. "We'll pray, we'll judge, and we'll vote. Until then, Thomas keeps them." The crowd dispersed, uneasy, whispers rising again like smoke after fire. Thomas turned and walked away, the children clutched tightly against him, their warmth the only thing anchoring him against the storm of voices. That night he didn't sleep. He sat by the fire, staring at the flames as the babies dozed, their breathing soft and steady. The weight of what lay ahead crushed him. 3 days. 3 days until the town decided their fate. He had faced blizzards, wolves, starvation, but never had he faced something so unbearable, the thought of losing the very lives he had sworn to protect. And somewhere in that silence the children stirred. One opened her eyes, dark, glistening, fragile, and for a fleeting moment Thomas swore he saw Clara's gaze staring back at him. It shook him to his core. He whispered into the firelight, "I won't let them take you, not while I breathe." But outside, in the dark pines beyond his cabin, Curtis Fletcher and 2 men watched from a distance, and Curtis's voice was like the hiss of a snake. 3 days is too long. By then, the town might take his side. We'll act before then. We'll have those children, one way or another. The night after the church meeting pressed down heavier than the storm that had claimed Clara's last breath. Thomas Hale barely moved from the fireside, his eyes locked on the 2 small bundles resting against the quilts he had laid with near reverence. Every snap of the fire made him flinch. Every gust of wind outside made him rise and check the door latch. He was no fool. He knew Curtis Fletcher's kind. Men who smiled with one hand extended while the other clenched a knife behind their back. The children breathed shallow but steady, their tiny fists twitching in their sleep. He sat forward, elbows on his knees, staring into the flames. He had never asked for this, never thought his life would be bound to 2 helpless souls, but Clara's last plea had carved itself into him. He could almost still hear it, "Name them after me." A vow unspoken but unbreakable. As the firelight flickered across his face, the sound came. A distant crunch, snow under boots. His head jerked toward the window. The horse outside gave a low whinny, uneasy. Thomas's hand went to the rifle by the hearth. Slowly, deliberately, he rose, every movement silent as a predator's. He leaned near the window, and in the sliver of moonlight, he caught the faint silhouette of men moving through the trees. They were here, Fletcher's men. His jaw tightened, heart pounding steady as a drum. He moved back to the fire, scooped the babies into the crook of his arm, and pulled the quilt around them. With the other hand, he hefted the rifle, cocking it with a sound loud enough to echo in the cabin. Whoever was outside would know he was ready. The knock came, sharp and mocking. "Open up, Hale," Curtis's voice called. "We're here for what ain't yours." Thomas's teeth clenched. He laid the children back in their crib, careful not to wake them, then leveled the rifle toward the door. "They're asleep," he growled. "Best leave before I wake them, and you." The men outside laughed, the sound harsh against the still night. "You think you can keep him? You're half wild yourself. The town will take him from you come morning, so why not save yourself the trouble?" Thomas stepped closer to the door, pressing the barrel against the wood as though the rifle itself might pierce their arrogance. "Because I gave her my word, and because they're breathing right now thanks to me, not you." For a moment, silence. Then Curtis's voice again, colder now. "3 days until the vote, Hale, but I don't plan to wait. You'll slip, and when you do, they'll be mine." Their footsteps crunched as they retreated, swallowed by the trees. But Thomas knew it was no victory. They would be back. The next morning, Thomas saddled his horse, the baby strapped against his chest beneath his heavy coat, and rode hard into town. He could feel their shallow breaths against him, their tiny hearts fluttering like trapped birds. He went straight to Hannah Parker's home, pounding on the door until she opened it with alarm. "They came," he said breathlessly. "In the night, Fletcher and his men." Her face hardened, eyes narrowing with fury. She reached out, taking one of the infants from him, her hands gentle but firm. "They'll stop at nothing. You mustn't be alone up there, not with them." Thomas shook his head. "I won't let them drive me from my cabin. That mountain's kept me alive all these years, it'll keep them too, but I need help. You said you'd teach me faster." Hannah studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "You'll stay here today. Watch, learn." And so he did. For hours, Thomas sat by the hearth as Hannah worked. She showed him how to hold them while feeding so they wouldn't choke, how to warm the milk just enough, how to check their tiny limbs for signs of weakness. Each instruction carved deeper into him, each small cry from the infants binding him tighter to them. When one of them wrapped her tiny fingers around his rough thumb, Thomas felt something break in him. He had faced blizzards, starvation, the loneliness of a cabin built on stone, but nothing had undone him like that small, fragile grip. By evening, when he left Hannah's home, he felt more capable but also more aware of the storm building beyond the walls of town. The whispers were louder now, sharper, as though Curtis had set the whole town's tongue wagging. "Best let the Fletchers take M. Mountain man don't know the first thing. Poor babes won't last a month." He rode out with his head high, but each word burrowed into him like a thorn. That night in his cabin, he fed them as Hannah had shown, humming low in his throat though he had no tune. The children settled, their cries softening, and for a moment the cabin felt almost like a home instead of a fortress. But the peace was fragile. Just before dawn, a sound shattered it, a window rattling, the faint scrape of wood. Thomas was on his feet in an instant, rifle in hand. He moved silently, the children still asleep against the quilts, and waited. A shadow slipped across the wall. He lunged, throwing the door open, rifle raised, and froze. It was Curtis. It wasn't any of his men. It was Ruth Miller. The stern widow stood there in the half-light, clutching a bundle of cloth in her arms. Her face was pinched with worry, her breath visible in the cold. "I came before they did," she said sharply, stepping inside without waiting for permission. She set the bundle down on his table, cloth diapers, goat's milk, a few jars of preserved vegetables. "You'll need these, and you'll need allies if you're going to keep them." Thomas lowered the rifle slowly, suspicion giving way to reluctant gratitude. "Why help me? The town's with the Fletchers." Ruth's eyes softened as she looked at the sleeping children. "Clara scrubbed my floors when I couldn't pay her. She mended my clothes when my hands gave out. I owe her, and I won't see her babes turned into trophies for the Fletchers' pride." Thomas's throat tightened. For the first time since Clara's last breath, he felt he was not alone. But even as Ruth spoke, the sound came again. Horses. Too many this time. Curtis was back, and not with 2 men but with half a dozen. Their shadows stretched across the snow as they dismounted, voices low but certain. Thomas looked at Ruth, his voice a growl. "Get low, keep quiet." He moved to the window, rifle ready, his heart pounding. Outside, Curtis's voice rang out. "This is the last time, Hale. Hand M over or we take M." The babies stirred in their sleep, their cries building like the warning of a storm about to break. And Thomas knew this was no longer about a vote or whispers or even Clara's last words. This was a siege. The morning broke with frost still clinging to the pines, but it was not the cold that made Thomas Hale's blood run hard in his veins. Outside his cabin, Curtis Fletcher and 6 men stood with rifles slung, their boots crunching into the snow, their faces set with the arrogance of those convinced the world belonged to them. The babies had begun to cry from the sound of voices, their whimpers rising in a thin chorus that cut through the silence like bells of warning. Thomas crouched low by the window, rifle at the ready. Ruth Miller knelt by the hearth, gathering the children close to her chest, her lips moving in quiet prayers. The firelight danced across her lined face, and though she was not a woman given to softness, the way she pressed the infants close revealed a tenderness forged by duty and memory of Clara's kindness. "Thomas Hale," Curtis's voice roared, carrying through the crisp air. "You got no claim. Those children belong to this town, and this town says they're ours." Thomas's jaw clenched, the muscles working like stone grinding against stone. He pushed the window open just enough to project his voice. "They're not yours, Fletcher. They're not trophies to polish your name. Their mother's last words were mine to bear, and I'll see them honored even if it costs me my life." Laughter broke out among the men, harsh and cruel. Curtis spat in the snow. "Then you'll lose more than your life. You'll lose those children anyway. You think one man can stand against the town, against me?" Thomas's hand tightened on the rifle, finger brushing the trigger, but he held. To fire first would be to doom them. He had to think, to wait, to outlast the storm circling his cabin. Ruth rose, her back straight, her eyes like flint. "Cowards," she hissed under her breath. 7 against 1 man holding 2 babes. God sees." The words gave Thomas a strange calm. His heart pounded, but not from fear, rather from a clarity that told him every decision he made from this moment would etch itself into those children's futures. He stepped to the door, threw it open, and stood tall against the biting air. The baby's cries swelled behind him as though urging him to speak. "You want them? Come through me." His voice carried deep and steady across the snow-packed clearing. "But know this, Clara gave them to me with her last breath, and if you try to take them, you'll not only fight a man, you'll fight her memory, and you'll fight God's judgment for desecrating it." For a moment silence, even the wind seemed to pause, then Curtis sneered. "Big words for a hermit, but words don't stop hunger, words don't change the vote." He waved his hand and 2 of his men stepped forward. Thomas raised the rifle, his voice cut like a blade. "1 step closer, and you'll be buried in the snow before nightfall." The men hesitated, glancing at Curtis. He snarled at their hesitation, his arrogance cracking. "You'll regret this, Hale. When the town votes, they'll strip those children from you anyway, and no rifle will stop that." Thomas's eyes burned like coals. "Then let the town see who tried to steal babes in the dark of morning. Go ahead, Fletcher. Show them what kind of man you are." The threat sank in. Curtis faltered, then turned with a growl. "This isn't over." He mounted his horse, his men following reluctantly. Their silhouettes vanished into the trees, but Thomas knew they were not gone for good. He shut the door and leaned against it, his breath ragged. Ruth laid the children back in their quilted bed, their cries easing into whimpers. "They won't stop," she said quietly. "Not until the vote or until they've ruined you." Thomas sank onto the bench, pressing his hands against his face. "Then I'll stand until I can't." The next 2 days dragged like years. Thomas barely slept, his ears sharp for the crunch of snow outside, the creak of wood, the distant crack of a twig. He rode each morning to Hannah Parker's home, learning faster, pushing himself beyond exhaustion. He fed the children with trembling patience, changed them, soothed their cries as best he could. Ruth came often, bringing what little she had, her stern face softening each time she held one of the babes. But the whispers in town were growing into a roar. Curtis Fletcher moved like a storm through Bitter Hollow, fanning doubts, buying loyalty with whiskey and promises. Marion Fletcher smiled sweetly in the church pews, whispering of a nursery already prepared, of tutors, of a life of comfort the children would never know with a mountain man. The tide was turning. Reverend Jonah Price called for prayer meetings, urging the town to set aside pride and vengeance, but even his words could not drown the murmurs. The town was a cauldron ready to boil over, and everyone knew it would spill on the third day, when the vote was cast. That night, the eve of the vote, the mountain storm returned. Snow fell heavy, the wind howling like wolves across the ridges. Thomas sat by the fire, the children cradled against him, their breaths shallow but steady. Ruth sat across from him, her eyes on the flames. "You should know," she said at last, her voice low. "The Fletchers won't wait for a fair vote. They'll do whatever it takes to have their way." Thomas's eyes narrowed. "Then I'll meet them head-on." But Ruth shook her head. "You're one man. They'll paint you as dangerous, as unfit, and the town may believe them." Thomas looked down at the children. Their tiny faces glowed in the firelight, fragile as the first buds of spring against snow. His chest tightened. He had lived alone for so long, never imagining his heart could be split open by two helpless souls. And yet here he was, ready to bleed for them, ready to fight an entire town if he had to. As the storm raged, a knock came at the door. Both Thomas and Ruth tensed. He rose slowly, rifle in hand, and opened it a crack. It was Reverend Jonah, his face pale from the cold, his beard stiff with frost. He stepped inside quickly, shutting out the wind. His eyes fell to the children, softening with grief and awe. "I came to warn you," he said, voice urgent. "Curtis means to sway the vote with lies. He's telling folk you took Clara by force, that the babes aren't even hers." Ruth gasped, "Blasphemy." Jonah nodded gravely. "He'll stop at nothing. But Thomas, I believe you. And tomorrow I'll stand before the whole town and say so. But you must be ready. When he strikes, he'll strike with venom." Thomas met his gaze, fire burning in his chest. "Then let him come. I'll not back down." The Reverend laid a hand on his shoulder. "Hold fast, for Clara's sake, for theirs." He looked to the children, his eyes glistening. "And may God's truth cut through their lies." The storm roared outside, the cabin trembling beneath its fury. Inside, Thomas sat once more by the fire, the weight of the children in his arms, the echo of Clara's last plea in his ears. The vote was tomorrow. Everything would break by then. And outside, unseen through the swirling snow, Curtis Fletcher rode with 3 men, carrying more than threats this time. He carried proof he had manufactured, letters forged, witnesses bribed, lies sharp enough to cut through truth itself. The storm had not yet lifted when dawn broke on the day of the vote. Bitter Hollow lay blanketed in white, the roofs sagging under snow, the trees bent low as though the mountains themselves bowed their heads in anticipation. Bells rang from the church, their hollow clang echoing across the valley, calling the town to gather. Inside his cabin, Thomas Hale pulled his coat tight around his shoulders, his jaw clenched as he secured the children in the thickest blankets he had. Their cheeks were pink, their breaths shallow but steady. Ruth Miller stood beside him, fastening her shawl with determined hands. She had insisted on coming with him. "You'll not face them alone," she said. Thomas nodded once, grateful though words stuck in his throat. He lifted the children, swaddled close against his chest, and stepped out into the cutting wind. The ride into town was slow, the snow deep, each hoofall muffled, but with every step his resolve hardened. Clara's last words echoed in his head, as if carried on the very wind. "Name them after me." When he reached the square, nearly the whole town had already gathered. The church doors stood open, light spilling onto the snow. Inside, benches were filled, whispers bouncing from wall to wall. At the front stood Curtis Fletcher, tall and smug, his wife Marion at his side, dressed in somber black as though she were a widow herself. Sheriff Alder raised a hand. "Quiet, quiet now. We're here for the matter of Clara's children. A vote will decide who takes them in. Each man and woman of age may speak." Thomas stepped forward, the children's cries beginning to stir at the sudden silence. His boots echoed against the wooden floor as he walked down the aisle, the crowd parting reluctantly. Whispers followed him, some pitying, some sharp with scorn. He ignored them all, walking with the steady weight of his vow. Reverend Jonah Price stood beside the pulpit, his face weary but resolute. "Let us begin with prayer," he said, bowing his head. A murmur of voices followed, though Thomas noticed Curtis's lips never moved. When the prayer ended, Curtis was the first to speak. He stepped forward, his voice carrying with practiced authority. "Good people of Bitter Hollow, you know me, you know my wife. We've lived among you, worked among you, built this town with our own hands. You know our home, warm, safe, full of means to raise children as they deserve." He gestured toward Thomas, his lip curling. "And you know him, a hermit, a man who hides in the mountains, who comes to town once a season for supplies. Is this the man to raise two helpless babes?" Murmurs of agreement rippled. Marian lowered her eyes demurely, as though her sorrow was too heavy to bear. Curtis pressed on. "And more, can we even trust his tale? He says Clara died in the snow. Yet where is her grave? Where are witnesses? For all we know, he took her. For all we know, these aren't even her children at all." Gasps echoed through the church. Faces turned toward Thomas, suspicion flaring. Curtis reached into his coat and pulled out papers, holding them high. "Letters," he announced. "Written by Clara herself months before she disappeared. Proof she feared Thomas Hale. Proof she knew he lingered near her home, watching." The crowd erupted. Some shouted in shock, others disbelief. Ruth gasped, eyes wide. Thomas felt the world tilt, the ground unsteady beneath him. He had never spoken to Clara beyond polite words in passing. Whatever letters Curtis held, they were forgeries, but convincing ones, judging by the crowd's reaction. Reverend Jonah raised his hand, shouting over the uproar. "Peace, let us hear both sides before we cast judgment." Thomas stepped forward, his voice cutting through the noise. "Curtis Fletcher lies." His words rang with iron. "I never touched Clara, never harmed her, never so much as spoke her name until her last breath. I found her in the snow, dying, her children clutched against her, and I heard her words with my own ears. I won't see them grow up, name them after me. That vow is mine to carry, and no forgery will take it from me." The crowd hushed, torn between doubt and the weight of his conviction. Ruth stepped forward then, her voice sharp as steel. "I knew Clara. She worked in my home. She mended my clothes. She spoke of her fears, but never of Thomas Hale. If she feared anyone, it was the hunger in her own belly. She would never write such lies." Curtis's face twisted with rage, but Marian quickly took his hand, feigning calm. "Ruth, you are mistaken. Grief clouds memory." But before Curtis could press further, Reverend Jonah raised his voice. "Enough. We've heard accusations. We've heard defense. Now each who wishes may speak." One by one, townsfolk rose. Some sided with the Fletchers, swayed by their wealth, their influence, and the forged letters. Others spoke for Thomas, recalling his lonely but honest life, his strength in carrying the children down from the storm. The church filled with clashing voices, anger rising like thunder. At last, Sheriff Alder raised his hand. "We've heard enough. The vote will be cast. All in favor of the Fletchers raising Clara's children, step to the left. All in favor of Thomas Hale to the right." The crowd shifted. Feet scuffed against the wooden floor. Families whispered hurriedly before moving. The left side swelled with numbers, the Fletchers' wealth-buying loyalty. The right grew too, but smaller, quieter, bolstered by Ruth, Hannah, and a scattering of others. Thomas stood tall, the children clutched to his chest, his side thin but unyielding. Curtis smirked, his numbers clearly greater. Sheriff Alder counted, his face grave. Then he turned to the room. "The majority stands with the Fletchers." A cheer rose from Curtis's side. Marian pressed a hand to her chest, feigning tears of relief. Thomas felt the air leave his lungs, his arms tightening around the children. Their cries rose, piercing, as though they sensed what was being decided. But before Curtis could step forward to claim them, Reverend Jonah's voice thundered. "Wait." The church fell silent. Jonah stepped into the aisle, his eyes blazing. "A vote may speak for numbers, but numbers do not always speak for God's truth. And I tell you now, those letters are lies." He turned, his finger stabbing toward Curtis. "I know Clara's hand. I baptized her children. I counseled her when her husband died. And those letters, those strokes, are not hers. They are forged. And Curtis Fletcher, I will answer before God himself if I am wrong." Gasps broke through the crowd. Curtis's face flushed red, veins standing at his temple. "You dare." "I do dare," Jonah thundered. "Because this is not about wealth or reputation. It is about two souls entrusted to the care of this town. And Thomas Hale, who risked the storm to carry them down, who heard their mother's last plea, is the only man among us who has bled for them already." The crowd wavered, doubt flooding faces once sure. Murmurs grew louder, suspicion shifting like a tide. Some who had stepped left began edging back, uncertainty gnawing at them. Curtis's fury boiled over. "This is theft," he shouted, his hand darting to the pistol at his hip. Gasps erupted. Marion cried out, clutching his arm, but Curtis shoved her aside. He raised the pistol, pointing it straight at Thomas. The children wailed, their cries high and desperate. Thomas's body turned instinctively, shielding them with his frame. His rifle hung on his back, out of reach, and for a moment it seemed death would fall before justice had a chance to speak. But then a shot rang out, not from Curtis's pistol but from the rear of the church. The weapon clattered from Curtis's hand, his arm jerking back with a cry. Smoke curled from Ruth Miller's pistol, her hand steady as stone. "You'll not make orphans of them twice," she said, her voice carrying like judgment itself. The church erupted into chaos, shouts, cries, men rushing to subdue Curtis as Marion screamed. The children cried harder, clinging to Thomas's chest as he held them, his heart hammering. And in the storm of confusion, one truth settled like iron. The fight was no longer about votes. It was about survival. The church was bedlam. Shouts collided with the children's cries, boots stamped against the floor, and hands clawed to seize Curtis Fletcher as he raged like a beast cornered. The pistol lay on the floor where Ruth's shot had knocked it free, its smoke still curling upward like the ghost of Clara herself condemning the lie. Curtis struggled against the men holding him, his face twisted with fury, spittle flying from his lips as he bellowed. "They're mine, mine by right." "No," Ruth answered from where she stood, her pistol steady, her hands as unshaking as her faith. "They were Clara's, and Thomas Hale alone honored her last breath." Reverend Jonah forced his way to the pulpit, his voice booming through the church. "Enough!" His hand slammed down on the wood with such force the sound cut through the chaos like a bell. "This house will not become a battleground for greed." Slowly the uproar dimmed, though Curtis still seethed, his chest heaving like a tethered bull. Sheriff Alder stepped forward then, his revolver drawn and pointed at Curtis's chest. "Fletcher, you've gone too far. Draw a gun in God's house, threaten a man holding babes, you've hung yourself before the town without need of rope." But Marion Fletcher wailed, throwing herself at her husband's side. "He only wanted what was best for them, don't you see? Thomas can't raise them alone." Her voice cracked, the carefully spun mask of poise falling to reveal desperation. Her arms clutched Curtis' as though she could drag him back from the judgment written across every face in the room. Thomas stood rooted near the front pew, the babies trembling in his arms, their tears soaking into his coat. Their cries cut deeper than any threat, their small voices begging him not to falter. He looked at them, fragile, helpless, everything Clara had left behind, and then he looked at the town, at the doubt and fear painted across their faces. "My life's not worth more than theirs," Thomas said, his voice low but heavy with truth. "If you strip them from me, if you give them to those who lie, then Clara's plea dies with her. I won't stand by while her memory is desecrated." The weight of his words pressed into every corner of the church. Even those who had doubted him shifted uneasily, unwilling to meet his eyes. Reverend Jonah raised a trembling hand and spoke once more. "The vote is broken. The deceit of letters, the threat of violence. God has shown the truth in his own way. These children were given into Thomas Hale's arms by Providence, and Providence has made it clear they are not to be taken from him." Gasps rippled. Curtis roared in protest, lunging forward until Alder and two other men forced him to his knees. His fury turned to wild laughter, sharp and unhinged. "You think you've won, Hale? You think the town will stand for this? Those babes will starve in your care, and when they do, it'll be on your head." Thomas's eyes burned as he glared down at him. "If they live or die, it'll be because I gave everything to keep them breathing. That's more than you ever planned." The sheriff shoved Curtis to his feet and marched him out, Marion trailing behind, her face pale and streaked with tears. The crowd remained, shaken and uncertain but no longer roaring. Ruth lowered her pistol, her hands finally trembling now that the danger had passed. The Reverend raised his hand again. "This matter is closed. The children stay with Thomas Hale, and let none say otherwise without bearing the curse of lying in God's sight." Slowly, one by one, the townsfolk filed out, whispering to one another, their eyes glancing back at Thomas as though trying to reconcile the man they had once called a hermit with the figure standing tall, cradling two orphans as if they were carved into his very flesh. When the church had emptied, Ruth came to him, her gaze fierce but softened by the tears glimmering there. "You held when no one else would. Clara would have wept to see it." Thomas swallowed hard, unable to speak. His arms tightened around the children, their cries fading now into weak hiccups, their heads heavy against his chest. But the battle was far from over. That evening, as Thomas trudged back to his cabin through the snow-laden woods, the children bound against him. He knew Curtis's words were more than spite. The fight in the church had silenced the town, but whispers would rise again. Doubts would creep back like shadows at dusk. The truth had carried the day, but it was a fragile truth, one that could be shaken if the children faltered, if Thomas faltered. Inside his cabin the fire crackled, the warmth wrapping around him as he laid the children in their crib. Their tiny breaths steadied, though their bodies were still too thin, too fragile. He sat on the bench, burying his face in his hands. He had won them in word, but now he had to win them in life. Every day from here forward would be proof that Clara's plea had not been in vain. Ruth arrived later, her shawl dusted with snow. She set down a bundle, more diapers, goat's milk, herbs for fevers, and sat without asking. "You can't do this alone," she said simply. Thomas looked up, weariness carved into every line of his face. "I don't have a choice." "You do," Ruth countered. "You've got me, you've got Hannah, even Reverend Jonah, though his strength lies more in words than hands. But you must let us in, Thomas, or you'll break under the weight." The words sank deep. For years he had built his life on solitude, on the belief that a man could stand against the wilderness if only his back was strong enough. But now, looking at the children, he knew Ruth was right. This was not a burden one man could bear alone. He nodded once. "Then help me keep them breathing, help me keep my vow." Ruth's stern face softened. "Then we'll keep it together." Yet even as that fragile alliance formed within the walls of his cabin, Curtis Fletcher's fury boiled over in the darkness of his ranch. He sat at a table, his wounded hand bandaged, his face twisted with rage. Marion hovered near, torn between pleading with him and fearing him. "You humiliated me," Curtis snarled, his voice low but venomous. "Me in front of the whole town. Do you think I'll let that stand?" "Curtis, please," Marion whispered. "Let it go. The town won't follow us now, not after what happened." His fist slammed against the table, rattling the lamp. "Then I'll make them follow. If the mountain man won't give them up, I'll take what he holds dearest and show this town he's nothing but a curse." Marion's eyes widened with dread. "You mean to kill him?" Curtis's grin was sharp, cruel. "Not just him. Let him feel what it's like to bury what you can't protect. Then we'll see if he still calls himself their guardian." The fire in the hearth flickered, shadows stretching across the walls as if recoiling from his words. The storm outside howled, but inside, a darker storm gathered, one that would not rest until either Thomas Hale or Curtis Fletcher lay broken beneath it. And back in the cabin on the mountain, Thomas held the children close, their tiny bodies pressed against his chest. He could not know the vengeance already racing toward him, but his heart told him the fight was not over. Clara's plea was not just a vow, it was a war. The final night came heavy with a silence so thick Thomas Hale could feel it pressing against his cabin walls. Snow lay deep on the mountain, muffling every sound, but he knew too well that danger thrived in silence. He sat by the fire, the children swaddled close against his chest, their tiny breaths warming the hollow in his coat. Ruth Miller dozed in the rocker, her pistol laid across her lap, and Hannah Parker slept against the far wall, having refused to leave when she saw the strain cutting through Thomas's body. He was not alone now, but his heart knew solitude still, solitude in carrying a vow that could not be shared. The children stirred and whimpered as though the air itself warned them. Thomas rose, pacing across the wooden floor, whispering softly, "Hush now, you're safe. You'll stay safe as long as I draw breath." His words weren't just to soothe them. They were his own anchor against the storm brewing in his veins. Outside, far down the slope, a glow flickered. Lanterns. They moved in a line, winding their way up through the trees, the light cutting through the dark like snakes of fire. Curtis Fletcher had come, and this time he hadn't brought 7 men. He had brought near 20. Ruth stirred, eyes snapping open. She saw the glow through the frost-kissed window and her jaw tightened. "It's him." Thomas laid the children back in their crib, pulling every quilt he owned across them. He checked his rifle, loading each chamber with hands steady as stone. Hannah's face drained of color, but her eyes held steady. "They won't stop," she whispered. Thomas nodded. "Then neither will I." The first voice rang out, harsh against the frozen air. "Curtis Fletcher. Hail, you defied me once, you shamed me before the town. But tonight the mountain decides who lives and who dies. Bring out those children and I'll leave you breathing." Thomas threw the door open wide, stepping into the cold. His breath smoked against the air, his rifle gleaming in the moonlight. "You've no claim, Fletcher," he called, his voice echoing through the pines. "Not by blood, not by vow, not by anything but greed. If you want them, you'll come through me, and the Lord himself will judge your hand before it strikes." Curtis's laugh split the night, cruel and hollow. "Then judge me he shall." He waved his men forward. The lanterns surged closer. Shadows loomed. Boots broke the snow's crust as rifles raised. Thomas braced himself in the doorway, every muscle taut, every breath drawn deep. The world slowed, his heartbeat thundering like a drum. He had lived his life for no one but himself until Clara's dying whisper bound him forever. Now his life was not his own, it was theirs. The first man stepped too close and Thomas fired. The shot cracked, echoing down the valley, the man dropping into the snow with a cry. Shouts erupted, guns raised, but Ruth's pistol flared from the window, her voice sharp. "Back, you devils, you'll not touch them." Chaos broke. Smoke filled the air as rifles thundered, sparks leaping from muzzles. Men fell, others dove behind trees. Hannah scrambled to reload rifles, her trembling hands steadying with each desperate movement. Thomas stood in the doorway, unyielding, each shot he fired measured, every breath a vow. But Curtis pressed forward, ducking between trees, his eyes fixed on the cabin. He shouted over the din, his voice raw with rage. "You can't keep them, Hale. They'll never live under your hand." Another volley split the air. A bullet slammed into the doorframe beside Thomas, splinters biting his cheek. He didn't falter. He sighted down the barrel, but before he fired, the children's cries pierced through the cabin walls. Their tiny voices rose above the chaos, high and desperate, pulling at every soul who heard. The men faltered. Some lowered their rifles, guilt etching across their faces. They were fathers, brothers, men who had heard infants cry in their own homes. Ruth's voice thundered from the window. "You hear them? That's Clara's blood crying out. You dare spill it twice." Curtis screamed, his fury wild. "Cowards, they're nothing but bait for my name." He charged forward, pistol raised. Thomas stepped into the snow, rifle lowered now, his voice carrying like a hammer. "Curtis Fletcher, look at them. Look at what you've become. A man who would kill children to polish his pride. Bitter Hollow will remember your name, but as a curse whispered in shame." Curtis hesitated, breath steaming, his pistol shaking. For the first time, doubt flickered across his face, but rage drowned it. With a snarl, he raised his weapon. And the crack of a rifle split the night. Curtis staggered, his pistol dropping into the snow, his hand clutching his chest. Thomas lowered his rifle, his chest heaving. Ruth stepped out beside him, her shawl whipping in the wind, her pistol still in hand. Hannah came after, her face pale but eyes steady. Together, they looked down at the man who had threatened to break everything, and together they turned their backs. Inside the cabin, the children still cried, their voices raw with fear but alive. Thomas gathered them up, holding them close, whispering, "Hush now, it's over, you'll grow, you'll live, I swear it." The next morning the church bell tolled, not for a vote but for a reckoning. Bitter Hollow gathered again, this time not in division but in silence. Curtis Fletcher was buried without pride, his name spoken in shame. Marion left the town soon after, unable to bear the weight of whispers. Reverend Jonah stood before the people, his voice steady. "The Lord's hand was heavy on this valley, but he has shown us truth. Clara's children live because one man bore her plea when the rest of us doubted. We were tested and many failed. But through Thomas Hale's vow and the blood that was spilled to keep it, God's mercy lives in these little ones. The town bowed their heads. Thomas stood at the back, the children cradled against him. He was no longer just a hermit in the mountains. Whispers now called him guardian, protector, father. His cabin would no longer be silent, for every cry, every laugh, every step those children took would be an echo of Clara's final words. That night, as snow fell soft across the pines, Thomas sat by the fire, the children resting against him, Ruth and Hannah nearby. He whispered into the flames, voice low but certain. "You'll see them grow, Clara. Through me, you'll see it. And their names will carry you just as their lives carry me." And for the first time, the mountain man smiled. Not with ease, not with joy unshaken, but with the quiet triumph of a man who had been broken open, only to find himself made whole by the very weight that threatened to crush him. The mountain had tested him, the town had doubted him, but in the end Clara's children lived, and through them her name lived also.